In my opinion, since the first parchment to fall off a printing press, words on pages have been used to manipulate thoughts inside of heads. And honestly, this goes for any form of media. The first silent film, for example, was a narrative about a woman growing children in a cabbage patch. And a picture is worth 1,000 words because there is always more to the story than meets the eye. This was just as true in 1825 as it is today. Much like our friend Ned Buntline, James Gordon Bennett had a command with his pen, but with very different interests in a very different background, most of which is told by a man named Isaac Clark Pray, a journalist apparently assigned to the job of giving Bennett a genuine, certified ball washing of the highest degree. In his, quote, spontaneous act of literary justice, which is hoped will carry along with it internal evidence of this fact, end quote. He gives you an account of Bennett's life that isn't well sourced. In fact, he has no first-hand knowledge. In his own words, quote, the author of these pages has sought no person's counsel upon his theme or its modes of treatment. Neither Mr. Bennett nor anyone connected with him has been consulted, neither directly or indirectly, end quote. Seems to me like this paragraph would only be necessary if Mr. Pray here was using his journalistic talents to act in the role of a quote-unquote successful theatrical manager rather than just a journalist whose sole job it is to present the facts.
And just the facts, ma'am.
Let us first understand what evidence is, to help us evaluate how much stock we should put into the only real account I could find of James Bennett's life before he made it to New York in 1822. Pursuant to United States Federal Rule of Evidence 602, need for personal knowledge, quote, a witness may testify to a matter only if evidence is introduced sufficient to support a finding that the witness has personal knowledge of the matter, end quote. A more accurate description of this book would be a data point, or a point of reference, but evidence it is not. And I say all that to say this, take everything we're about to learn about Mr. Bennett with a grain of salt. As is the story with many of these Shakespearean rags-to-riches characters, their lives, and especially their early lives, are often convoluted, misguided, and purposefully obscured for the most basic reason of plausible deniability. If you don't know where someone came from, it can be hard to figure out where they are heading, which can lead to a very easy way to hide motives. A perfect example of this is Jim Morrison with the very popular band of the time, The Doors. At the height of his popularity, Jim was thought to be a grungy kid from California who got together with a couple of buddies, strummed a guitar, and helped fuel a movement across America that on the exterior looked like a grassroots free love counterculture that was
Really sticking it to the man.
How many of those people would have blindly followed
Had they known the truth?
that Jim's father was Admiral Morrison, top brass of the Navy, a real mover and shaker, directly connected
To Laurel Canyon in the Gulf of Tonkin.
Now, I'm not saying everything we are about to learn about Bennett is made up, but what I am saying is the author of The Memoirs of James Gordon Bennett seems to be talking out both sides of his mouth. Bennett's mother and father reared a family in the Duff House of Scotland, an interesting place ruled over by Lord Fife, which Mr. Pray feels the need to go on and on about how wonderful of a man he was and the contrast of the noble and the natured mind throughout the land. The parts of the land he ruled over were said to be beautiful and also weren't subject to the feudal system so common at the time. which is dandy, wonderful. I love the benevolent dictators. But it was a lot of flowery, borderline confusing banter to get to the point that Bennett is from a prominent Catholic family. Quote, of the few families which were elevated above the condition of shepherds and farmers, one was that of the Bennets, end quote, whose ancestors, the Benoits, immigrated from France. They were, quote, trained noblemen of the home of Gordon, who established his seat in these lovely regions of the north of Scotland, end quote. His family literally played a hand in founding Scotland. And at the same time, we're supposed to believe that, quote, his experience in Boston at first was severe, as can be well imagined. He knew no one there, and being soon entirely without money or employment, end quote. Because he had apparently immigrated to America on a whim with his friend William on April 6, circa 1819, to, quote, see the place where Franklin was born. What a noble reason to want to travel to the land of the free. Bennett claimed to be an avid reader and fan of Benjamin Franklin, and apparently wanted to see what this whole freedom riffraff was all about, and in my opinion, assist in putting an end to it.
Whether he knew it at the time or not.
So the journey was commenced, and, quote, there is little known of Bennett's history while in Boston, end quote. But we are supposed to believe that when he landed in Boston, he quickly befriended a destitute countryman, and he immediately divided his purse with him, and the money he loaned was never restored. Not only did the debt never get repaid, but this same man, years later, became the editor to a popular journal and apparently released the, quote, the most calumnious attacks against him, which motives were attributed to finding favor with a particular class of people. And the source of all this is,
Trust me, bro,
the same source that is attributed to how Mr. Bennett even found an interest in publishing in the first place. Quote, recollections of him necessarily are obscure and unsatisfactory, end quote. Why necessarily? Just seems like an interesting way to describe someone's early life. I will say, he is a difficult man to find information about, until he started his paper in New York City. And I think there's a lot more to this man than meets the eye. When I started looking into him, I thought I would be able to condense the subject into one video. But I'm quickly realizing his journey before he even gets to New York needs a little more scrutiny.
a very interesting and peculiar character for sure.
After finding notoriety in the media and politics, his history and origins obviously became a topic of talk, enough for Bennett to give a tongue-in-cheek response to the issue. And if I'm being honest, it was a good response. Never bow to your critics. Lean in, take it on the chin, and keep it moving. Which is exactly what he did. A huge reason why he was such an effective journalist. And I don't use the word effective on accident. Much like Ned Buntline, James Gordon Bennett knew how to use words to effect emotion enough for people to take action. But as stated before, the two men had diametrically opposed motives and audiences. Buntline often attracted the attention of the common man, who had to wake up and work for a living. Maybe even get dirty before he came back home to the tenements, just hoping him and the wife could gather enough food for the children without being stabbed by a Bowery boy. While it was always said that Bennett's paper did its best to stay apolitical and was even famous for giving Abe Lincoln a hard time throughout the entire Civil War, I would say that's true, but I would also say that it's easy to stay apolitical when your interests are more aligned with bankers and Brits than politicians. Bankers don't recognize political parties and territorial boundaries unless, of course, it's to their advantage. And Britain's only goal since America was founded has been to get these dirty, rotten, tax-hating, freedom lovers back under the chains of the crown. And because of the Monroe Doctrine, they could no longer be so loud about it. They had to use different tools to subvert the spirit of freedom. The two most effective being newspapers and immigration. Bennett's paper could often boast about being the most circulated in the country. Is it any wonder how these two media outlets were able to gather 10,000 people
To a theater.
the Astor Place Theater, to have a mostly peaceful protest. But we're not quite ready to head there yet. We need to understand how Bennett found his way to New York City first, and examine what influenced Bennett to become such a prominent voice in the early days of print media. He is credited with many firsts and achievements, just a few of them being financial journalism, the first direct personal interview, the first systemic use of foreign correspondence and war correspondence, as well as being credited with forming the Associated Press. But most importantly is the never-ending pursuit of the most sensational stories circulating the streets at the moment. Now, knowing what we know about media today, this seems like a very,
chicken or egg situation to me.
Were the stories sensational, or did Bennett know how to carefully form his paragraphs and place his words in such a way the audience is to believe something mundane or even seemingly inconsequential is actually a riveting story to have you ride a certain emotion on a moving journey to come
to a predetermined conclusion?
Words have meaning. Have you ever wondered why placing particular symbols in a particular way in order to be able to cognize language and communication is called
spelling?
No, me either. I don't question anything because conspiracy
Theories are dangerous.
Another thing Bennett had in common with Buntline is they were both present at more than one mostly peaceful protest. Since the early days of Bennett in media, he has found the good fortune of being in the vicinity of big events, many of which at the time were riots, which were blamed on rowdy, destitute, unsophisticated swine that was the Irish Catholic immigrant population and native-born Americans that just couldn't handle their alcohol, and arguments over whose country had the best actors would often end up in dozens of dead poor people. These are all stories I don't buy for a second, and as we get further down the line and all aboard, we will continue to explore the environment that was the 1800s. And I hope to one day paint a true picture of why America was in such turmoil, and so many people were more than willing to die for their country and their freedom.
Two things we don't have much of anymore because of fairy tales told in newspapers to honest people who don't have enough time
To accurately assess
Information necessary to comprehend reality that has been constructed around us, mostly in our minds.
Quote, the popular clamor against Mr. Keene as the riot in May 1836 against the Woods was excited by a newspaper. It was done by the New England Galaxy, found and edited by the much respected veteran Joseph T. Buckingham,
whose example as a journalist must have had
no little weight
upon the mind of Mr. Bennett.
and sometimes
We get the truth.
Join me next time on All Aboard as we dig a little deeper into our puppet Bennett, and we meet back up with our cowboy Buntline in New York City, where Bennett had almost had a decade to set up his media empire before Ned rolled into town.
And started to fucking shit up.
In Ned's defense, New York City was an ever-changing place ever since Manhattan was bought from the Indians for like 2 baskets of bananas or something. I'm only halfway exaggerating. This place has been an absolute circus since the bankers got there, before America was even founded. And I hope you join me as we continue to explore that absolutely ridiculous, crazy time. Like and subscribe. Let me know what you think in the comments below. See you next time.
That's the important thing here, is that everyone's word should be meant for a use.
And the words that I'm using today are meant to pull down idols within people's temples.
Meaning that I want to destroy
Falsities that they have idolized,
for their entire life.
and just pull those out and sweep them clean. And before that temple,
And get reinfested with a new lie. Give it true life.